Kingdoms rise and fall, tyrants conquer and get vanquished. A lot has happened in the 3000 years after Alfred's passing, but it was the oracles that foresaw these events and prospered through the chaos. Now in time of peace, a new gifted human arises from the newly formed sanctuary which holds its fate in her hands. Hexaorb Sorceress is the new United Sanctuary prodigy that brings back the lost arts of oracles and revelations. She commands not only over her own destiny, but even her foes. With this power, she's able to predict the flow of battle and prepare accordingly to benefit the most from the events to come. Divine Revelation allows Hexaorb Sorceress to gain double the value of your trigger checks because she is able to give 10k power to another rearguard. This ability allows her to put not only more power onto the board, but also makes guarding against the Vanguard attack even tougher, as you can potentially give 20k power to the one attack if you have a booster behind your Vanguard, thus making your opponent always second guess when they decide to guard your Hexaorb Sorceress attack. But her true power shows when she unleashes her Astral Persona shift. This allows her to tap into the power of Persona Ride, because once you Persona Ride, you are able to put a critical trigger or a front trigger on the top of your deck, and she gains an additional drive check. This not only allows you to secure at least one trigger to be hit in your drive checks, thus allowing you to benefit of the Divine Revelation skill on top of it, but it also makes it harder for your opponent to guard your attacks in the first place. However, you don't necessarily have to put a trigger from your hand onto the top of your deck. You can just use this skill to get an extra drive check. Hexaorb Sorceress benefits a lot from drive checking specific cards or hitting triggers, but she herself doesn't do a lot of deck manipulation. This is where her key cards come into play, where it allows you to benefit the most from this mechanic. One of those new cards being the brand new Grade 2 Exquisite Knight Olwein. This not only allows us to manipulate the top two cards of our deck, thus being able to see our twin drive, but it also is another potential strong attacker, where it together with Hexaorb Sorceress can make one trigger be equivalent to an increase of 30k power for just one counterblast. With all the deck manipulation and with Olwein being able to see the top two cards of the deck, we can really benefit from the brand new Grade 1 Diaglass Sorceress. This card allows us to superior call the top two cards of our deck, thus generating a lot of value and keeping the cards in our hand for shield value. This card combos very nicely with Olwein, as Olwein allows us to see the top two cards, thus we know exactly what we can superior call with Diaglass Sorceress, but this also works very effectively with Pentagleam Sorceress right skill, as then we can see the top three cards, thus setting up exactly the two superior calls that we can do with Diaglass Sorceress. Another new addition for the Hexaorb Sorceress deck is the brand new Grade 3 Octodevoted Sorceress. This is a research engine that allows us to generate Counterblast or Soul Blast, but it can also be a 2-card combo of a potential multi-attack strategy. The second part of that multi-attack combo is the Grade 3 Heavenly Staff of Kind Intention Colthese. This card allows us to superior call to the field once we drive check it if we have an open rearguard circle. If we combine this with Octodevoted Sorceress, we can open up that circle after she attacked and then call this card to that new open circle and be able to generate an additional attack for free. And there are multiple ways to set this up, as we can use Olwein, which can see the top two cards, so if one of them is a trigger and one of them is Colthese, we can move the trigger on top of Colthese, so we will drive check the trigger first, retiring the Octodevoted Sorceress and then superior call on the Colthese. But we can also do this with the on-right skill of Pentagleam Sorceress, as we can see the top three cards, thus increasing the chance of actually seeing a trigger as well as Colthese in the top cards. But there's another option to multi-attack with Hexaorb Sorceress, and that is with the Grade 3 Divine Sister Lapisto. This is a very easy way to multi-attack, as we just have to hit a trigger, but it does cost 2 counterblasts. But with a card like Octodevoted Sorceress, we can definitely secure the counterblast cost that this card needs to be able to multi-attack. And then the final new key piece that's been introduced in the new support wave is a brand new Grade 1 Advanced Magic Melcoco. This is a great cycle card that allows us to churn faster through our deck, and as soon as we first draw and then discard, we can make the right decision to know what we're going to ditch. And this is very important because we are going to need specific key pieces in our hand, and more importantly, we need those Persona rights of Hexaorb Sorceress at all times. The right line for this strategy is going to be the generic right line for Hexaorb Sorceress. So we're going to see us going from Triconnect Sorceress into Tier Square Sorceress into Pentagleam into Hexaorb herself. This right line gives us access to all the things that we're going to need to facilitate our game plan, as Tier Square Sorceress allows us to draw a card into the early game. It's not the greatest of value, but it gets the job done, as it allows us to draw into our key pieces that we're going to need, as well as increasing the consistency of actually drawing into our Persona right copies for Hexaorb Sorceress. And then we have Pentagleam Sorceress, which will set up our plays when we go into Hexaorb Sorceress very nicely, as we can manipulate the top 3 cards of our deck, which not only will set up our Twin Drive for our offensive plays, but it can also set up nicely for cards like Diaglass Sorceress, thus allowing us to superior call multiple cards to the field and generate a lot of value right on turn 3. So this right line is effectively a setup strategy where once we hit our grade 3 turn, we want to start putting up a lot of pressure and manipulate our deck at a high consistency so we can pressure our opponent with all our attacks and potential trigger drive checks. Now, as for the trigger lineup for Hexaorb Sorceress, overall it's relatively flexible because every single type of trigger makes sense. As criticals and fronts, you probably want to play them because of your Persona right skill that allows you to put those back onto the top of your deck. So if you don't play them, you're probably not going to get the value of the Persona right skill in the first place. So you need to run a significant amount of those cards to always have one in your hand. But draws do have some value because the deck does need its Persona rights to effectively have an explosive turn, so you might maybe want to experiment with potentially running draws. Personally, I would go more with a 7 crit and 4 of the new front type of variant, because it means that if we have a trigger in our hand, it's most likely will be a trigger that's synergized with our Persona right, and they do give the significant amount of shield value that we're going to need, because this deck is more of a late game strategy, as it hinges more on the Persona right turn itself, and every subsequent turn after that. Now for this spotlight, I have one specific build for Hexaorb Sorceress, which is a good base variant, and then from that variant you can effectively experiment and start to change the list slowly into your own personal preference or specific tech choices. That build being this list. So as you can see, we have all the generic stuff that we just talked about. We have our Hexaorb Sorceress right line, we have the 3 Persona right copies, of course, as we need to max out on those. We got 3 Lepistos for our multi-tech plays, but we also have the 4 Octodevot Sorceress, as well as the Colthese for the other multi-tech strategy, but we mainly focus on Octodevot for the counter charge and potential soul charge if we need those resources, and the Colthese is just an extra bonus on top of it, just in the case that it might come up. That's why we only play 2 copies. Now we also see the rest of the 3 copies of our grade 2 of the right line, Pentagleam Sorceress. We still play her in the main deck, just by the sheer fact that she is another way to manipulate the deck. It's only 1, but it's a free call skill, so there's definitely no harm in actually having that extra potential deck manipulation. And you can use it on turn 2 to be a bit more aggressive if you want the pressure with your Vanguard attack on the early game as well. Then we have also 4 copies of Olwein. This is a great card that not only puts potential pressure if we have the extra counterblast, but it also synergizes very nicely with Diaglass Sorceress. That said, we also run the 4 copies of the Diaglass Sorceress, which allows us to get more value of the multiple top X card deck manipulation, as we can just superior call all the non-triggers to the field if we see no triggers in the top cards of our deck. And then to round off, we've got the cycle card in the form of Melcoco. The overall Hexaorb Sorceress is a relatively straightforward strategy because it's all about deck manipulating in specific ways, where either you stack non-trigger units on the top of your deck, thus being able to superior call with your Diaglass Sorceress for maximum value, or you stack triggers so you're going to get more value of your Hexaorb Sorceress, or potentially Olwein if you're going to use the counterblast. This then also synergizes with your Lepistos as well as Octodevot, because they then also will trigger for potential restands or for extra free resources. Now the important thing to keep in mind is that you won't be always consistently Persona riding with Hexaorb Sorceress, so you need to prepare in scenarios where you're not going to see any. And it doesn't mean that the deck cannot perform without Persona riding, because the deck definitely has enough options to still pressure. You could still deck manipulate, which allows you to have a higher consistency of hitting triggers, but Hexaorb Sorceress' first ability, her Divine Revelation, gives you so much pushing power, which makes it very hard for your opponent to keep guarding every single attack, because your triggers are double the value. And more importantly, you want to call a grade 1 behind your Vanguard and have it there at all times, because this means if your opponent doesn't perfect guard the attack, there is a high chance that you will break through the attack, even if they make a 2 to pass, or a 3 to pass, or maybe guard with the over trigger. Because keep in mind, Your triggers in that specific scenario generate 20k power. You give 10k power from the trigger to your Vanguard, and then you use Hexaorb Sorceress skill to give the additional 10k power to the boosting rearguard, thus increasing the power of the attack with an additional 10k power. This means if you attack with a grade 1 boosted by a non-Persona Ride turn Hexaorb Sorceress, the attack is going to be 21k. You can make it reach 61k if you hit 2 triggers if you put it all onto the Vanguard column. That in itself can almost break through an over trigger guard. So if it was during a Persona Ride turn, you can actually break through an over trigger guard with hitting 2 normal triggers in your drive check. So try to capitalize on that aspect of Hexaorb Sorceress, because that's where a lot of value of Hexaorb Sorceress lies. Now we do have a lot of other options, because this is far from the only way how you can build Hexaorb Sorceress. There are a lot of different tactics you can deploy, or a lot of specific tech options, and let's go over some of them so you can decide which one you want to try out, or maybe how you want to customize your deck. One of those options that we have is the grade 1 of the right line itself, which is Tier Square Sorceress. You can run this in your main deck by the fact that if you want to have some extra removal in your arsenal. This might come up in certain scenarios because it allows you to put them back into the deck, and in some instances this might hurt certain strategies more than just straight out retire. If you're up against like something like Magnolia or Zorga, this can hurt them because they have drop zone recursion. But if you shovel back their key cards back into the bottom of the deck, they're stuck there. They have no good way to get those cards out of the deck if they cannot shuffle and they only have top deck milling. This is a nice way to counteract those strategies, as well as just sheer generic removal. Another option that might be of your interest is Painkiller Angel. This is effectively the same card as Melcoco. The only difference is that this grade 1 will retire herself, so she removes from the field, and that means you have no control over what you actually are going to discard in a cycle. The discard is effectively always going to be Painkiller Angel. Now that might be a good thing, that might be a bad thing. It depends on your stance, and it depends on the meta. If you know that Leonard is going to be a thing in your environment, maybe Painkiller Angel is going to be a better tech option because it removes the boosters from your field, thus making Leonard less of a threat for you to deal with because they cannot attack an entire column. Another potential option as a more aggressive beater is the new grade 2 RR Sterilize Angel. This is effectively a 50k beater that can go off on turn 2 and onwards, especially in this deck, because you're going to counterblast quite heavily with all your specific skills. And with Olwein in the mix, you can make sure your counterblasts are always going to be face down while still applying a lot of pressure. So you can use this to be a bit more aggressive in the early game and to capitalize on those specific interactions. Another great additional option is the grade 3 Knight of War damage Fosado. This is another way to put hit pressure behind your attacks, and the countercharge and the soul charge is going to be very useful because we're going to use all the resources in this deck. So generating them is really nice, and the fact that we can manipulate the top X cards of our deck, we can to some extent predict what we're going to soul charge if we attack in a specific way. So this is a nice way to know what you're going to generate. And finally, we have another grade 3 which can be a potential option, which is Knight of Broadaxe Rafluke. Now this might sound like a weird option, but this is a card that generates soul, which we're going to use in this deck, but more importantly, one of our most strongest units is a grade 3 unit in the form of Lepisto. And you want to rely on Lepisto for the consistent multi-tech option. And being able to give Lepisto just an additional 10k power, so her first attack is 23k, and then she swings for 28k unboosted, and not including a Persona Ride turn on top of it, that's actually pretty solid. So Rafluke could be a nice option as a tech choice if you want to rely on the Lepisto's restand capabilities a bit more. And that is Hexaorb Sorceress. Overall, this is honestly a very interesting and very fun deck to play because it allows you to manipulate your deck and allows you to strategize around the top cards of your deck. And I've always been a fan about these strategies, and this particular iteration of this deck manipulation allows you to do a lot of interesting things, and it's also open up for a lot of different options to use your cards in, which is always going to be a fun thing, and with that brings also a lot of things you need to understand and to learn about, and the best way to get that far with this deck is just to play, and play. So with the information that we talked about in this video, it basically gives you the basics, and what you now need to do is just try out the deck, learn these intricate interactions, and to understand what the best course of action is with deck manipulation and knowing when to stack certain cards. And once you figure that out by just playing a lot of times, you will figure out how strong Hexaorb Sorceress actually can be. And besides the options that I provided in this video, there are definitely way more ways that you can build a deck, as Hexaorb Sorceress is a very interesting concept which allows it to be customized for any type of player in any way you possibly can imagine. But with that said, let me know in the comments down below what you guys think of Hexaorb Sorceress. I'm very very curious what your thoughts is about the deck manipulation strategy that makes its return in standard. So I'm very curious about your thoughts. But with that said, I want to give a huge shout out to my Patreon supporters over at patreon.com. You guys are amazing. If you do want to support the channel or everything that's happening on the channel, you can simply go to patreon.com/FingTheInsider and become a Patreon today. But with that said, I've been Mr. Time Leap, and I'll see you guys in the next one!